I'd like to say a very warm welcome to everyone this afternoon. My name is Angela McCusker and I am one of the trustees for the Mindfulness Initiative. You're very welcome to this webinar, and it's a follow-on debate and discussion from the Mindfulness Initiative's publication, Mindfulness Developing Agency in Urgent Times. And as Jon Kabat-Zinn said in his foreword, there's an urgency for this conversation to happen. I'd like to welcome our panelists this afternoon, who are Menka Sangve, Dr. Rachel Lilly, Dusana Dorji, and Mark Leonard. And we're going to also have a video from Dr. Tina Bassi. We also have this afternoon Jamie Bristow from the Mindfulness Initiative, who co-authored that report and who's going to introduce this afternoon's topics. We're going to have each speaker, I will introduce you, give you a bit of background. They will then have about 5 to 7 minutes to introduce their essay. We're going to have a short pause then for you to have some reflection, and then we'll go through the speakers and the video from Dr. Tina Bassi, and we'll have a Q&A at the end. But before we start, as we're all talking about mindfulness, I thought it might be quite a good idea just to have a very, very short pause, a very short mindful pause, just to gather our thoughts, just notice if we can let go of any distractions of everything that's happened today before we actually start our session. So just a very quick pause at 30 seconds, just gather our thoughts and have a short pause.
Thanks, Angela, and say a big welcome to Angela, who's a newish member of our board of trustees, joined us in the spring, and we're really lucky to have her on the team. This is the first time we've done something together, so yeah, really good to have you with us, Angela. So good afternoon, good morning, wherever you're calling from. Thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm really thrilled that we're here to have a conversation, to continue a conversation, a discussion that we attempted to develop and to some extent spark with our publication last year, Developing Agency in Urgent Times. I'd just like to share with you some of the reasons why we did the research and development and writing of this publication, and also just offer a few words about agency, about the concept, and which I think we'll end up talking to some extent about today, as well as the detail of the essays that our esteemed panel have contributed. So. Yeah, there are many reasons why we've published Mindfulness Developing Agency in Urgent Times. One is that we felt that there was a need to create a framework and offer the language to give form to people's intuitions about how mindfulness is more than just a well-being intervention, and that it has a kind of profound impact on their lives beyond health and perhaps beyond happiness, about like how they relate to the world and how we act individually and together. And indeed, one of the bits of feedback we've had for the document that I'm most proud of, it was from South Africa. It was the let me just get his title up here. Simon Weitzman, who was the chair of the Institute for Mindfulness in South Africa, and he told us that that reading this publication was like reading a beautifully crafted and articulated reflection of his own seen and hidden highest thoughts and feelings. So that was joyous to read. because I felt that I really wanted to say something about the role of mindfulness, but didn't quite have the language which was sort of robust and credible enough. And it sort of ended up seeming quite highfalutin or visionary, and to some extent separated from the evidence base, which tends to be quite fragmented and instrumental. And so helping us to kind of bridge the gap between, yes, the kind of detail of the evidence base and the the intuitions that many of us have had. And this required a job of sort of synthesis, stretching a little bit beyond perhaps the what we can say absolutely with 100% confidence, so robustly from a scientific point of view. But we said it as robustly as we could, threading through the evidence, through every line, having basically almost having a reference by it. But in that kind of act of synthesis and trying to do that bridging, it's an act of creativity as well. And it is just a kind of an offering, one narrative that you could make to try and join these dots together. And this narrative needs to evolve, it needs to be critiqued, it needs to be developed. And that's why we framed it as a discussion paper, not as the authoritative, final word. And so in order to facilitate the next phase of that discussion, we wanted to use our platform, use some of our admittedly very limited resources, but to try and hear from some other voices. And we intend for this to be the beginning of a process. So we'll publish some more essays if you have some offerings that you'd like to contribute. Please get in touch with us. But we'll also be working in this area for a few years. And the other thing is that we wanted to offer this narrative that makes sense of mindfulness for people who work in the sector, more in terms of how it can be a social good and help with social change, and also help people in the social change world to understand the potential for mindfulness to support what they do. And so, advocating really for kind of a social change lens within the mindfulness world and a mindfulness lens within the social change world, and bringing those two worlds a little bit closer together. And I think actually the essays that we've collected together, the 11 essays that are now free on our website, I think some of those essays actually take our work a step further and make it even more explicit as to what needs to happen with regards to using mindfulness for more social purposes. So that's the intention. I'm just thrilled. We've got a few people here to just give you a little taste of what you can find in the full publication. Firstly, just a couple of thoughts on agency, because we'll inevitably get stuck into what is this word? Well, our definition is that agency is understood as capacity for intentional action. And in the kind of I'm going to get philosophical for a minute. So don't worry if I lose you a bit. It's not entirely necessary. But in order to think about agency, we must think about the kind of the entity which is agentic, which has agency. That is something which we allow to have intention. So an animal, a person, a group, an organization, a country that has the capacity to decide to act or not act in order to create change or resist change. And so fundamental to the question of agency is what is that entity in the first place? The subject, the agentic being. With regards to the self being having agency or not having agency, there's this question of whether the self is sort of sovereign, a separate actor, or is it sort of entirely conditioned, contingent, enmeshed, emergent phenomena, like devoid of free will in some people's views, or is it somewhere in between? And the answer to this question, I believe anyway, is that it depends upon your way of looking. So depending on your way of looking on the self, on the neighborhood, on your team, on your country, you can see those as sort of as nouns, as entities that have agency or not, or you can see them as sort of completely dependent on the conditions that give rise to them. So this question of what is agency and do we have it and who has it, etc., I think does, as Jon Kabat-Zinn alludes to actually in the foreword of his for the collection of essays, it does come down to this question of self and what is it, sort of if we get too noodly about what is agency. So I'll cut it there, even though I could probably ramble on for a bit longer, because I've already gone over my time. Angela is going to be a very tough chair on all the speakers, much tougher, I think, than she's been on me, and trying to limit everyone to 5 minutes so we can have a pause in between. So back over to you, Angela. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, we were ahead of time, so I let you go on for a minute or two. I'm very pleased to welcome this afternoon our first essayist, which is Menka Sangvi. Her essay is entitled, "Why Am I Seeing This? Algorithms Making Choices for Us." So Menka Sangvi is a multidisciplinary researcher and facilitator. She works on creative projects for spreading mindfulness and compassion in contemporary contexts. She is also the lead author of Field Book for Mindfulness, Mindfulness Innovators, which has been published by the Mindfulness Initiative. She's a director of learning at Mind Over Tech's Digital Habits Academy. That's an interesting one. I need to look that one up. And the creator of a mindful photography club. So quite a lot going on there. So Menka, very welcome, and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Jamie. Thanks for the warm welcome and the opportunity to be part of this conversation. It's one that feels really, really important to me. So it's a real pleasure to be able to contribute. My essay, as you mentioned, is called "Why Am I Seeing This?" And it's about questioning our online experience that is increasingly mediated by algorithms. When I read Jamie, Rosie, and Dan's manifesto, if I can call it that, this was a dimension of the problem statement that I felt was underplayed. It's something that makes practicing mindfulness more difficult and at the same time more critical. So I'll start with sharing something seemingly minor that happened just a few days ago. I was talking to a friend about how I discovered this really great brand of chocolate through Instagram that easily ticked all my boxes. It's plant-based, fair trade, sustainable, dark, but not too dark. And I bought it and I loved it. So thank you, algorithm, for figuring me out and showing me exactly what I would want. That felt actually helpful. So my friend, Zach, asked, would it have been even better if the platform sensed that you were eventually going to buy this item and just placed the order for you and sent it to you automatically? Imagine the doorbell ringing just as you move your mouse towards the buy now button. Is that a good thing? I instinctively said no, because at the end of the day, I don't want to be surrendering my daily decisions to machines. The machine doesn't know everything about me in relation to these decisions. And even if it did, if it were able to factor in everything, I still don't want to be defined and boxed in. I might want to try something different instead of what I usually go in for. I want the space to grow. So this is an everyday experience and feelings that many of you will be able to relate to, I'm sure. But what does it really mean for our agency, our freedom, our ability to act on our most authentic intentions? So firstly, I'm going to say two things, because we've only got a few minutes. So firstly, there is a question about where the line is between being helped and being spoken for, like the line between a friendly suggestion and coercion. There's a lot of research happening in this area about how to make recommendations much more powerful, mostly by data scientists who are working for marketing companies. And they're playing with so many variables: the frequency of information, the timing of it, the context in which you see it. And the aim here is eventually these recommendation algorithms will function like decider algorithms. one experiment that I came across in my research is a group of people were given a playlist, a music playlist, and a star rating by each song. They were told that the rating was done by an algorithm based on their past preferences and behavior. In reality, the ratings were completely random. But amazingly, people actually claimed to prefer the songs that the algorithms had supposedly picked out for them, the ones with the higher ratings, even after listening to all the songs. So in other words, they trusted the system's judgment more than their own. So it's really subtle, you know, these desires and tastes of ours being shaped. So secondly, another big question that comes up for me a lot is this always a bad thing? Like if we're thinking about chocolate and music, then yeah, okay, it's not such a big deal. But of course, our data is being used to sell us all kinds of things, ideologies, worldviews, kinships, and that worries me. But what if we could try and use this for a positive impact? For example, take climate change. If we could change people's thinking and behavior in relation to climate change, what if we could use our knowledge and power for collective good, so to speak? And so for context, I'll just share something about my background, which is for 15 years, I worked on social and environmental change for organizations like the UN and Oxfam, social enterprises, corporate sustainability projects. And my role was in design and innovation. So basically creating new products and services that would enable people to be kinder in some way, you know, connecting with the bigger picture, connecting with vulnerable populations, connecting with the natural world. In doing this work, one thing I realized over and over again is that the most meaningful outer changes in our behavior are always a manifestation of our inner change. So otherwise, the changes tend to be superficial and also easily reversible. So that's the insight that made me so passionate about applying design thinking to projects that help create the conditions for inner growth, specifically for cultivating the capacities of mindfulness, curiosity, wonder, compassion. And they're also closely connected. My meditation teacher always says that if you start with one, the others tend to follow. And so, for example, okay, just to wrap up, Angela mentioned I'm currently working with a design-led company called Mind Over Tech. And as the name implies, the focus is to build awareness and intentionality in and through our relationship with technology. So not focusing on, for example, apps that regulate your behavior from the outside, locking you out of your device, for example, but on inner growth, developing that capacity for attention regulation, embodiment, and kindness for yourself and for others. So going back to that question briefly, is using algorithms for behavioral change always a bad thing? Perhaps not in the short term, but longer term, what we really want is for people to be thinking and acting with clarity of purpose. We want to avoid the internalized automation. And this is, of course, where mindfulness training comes in, being able to guard our attention, step back from thoughts, to be humble and curious. And perhaps most importantly, we want to cultivate the cognitive flexibility to be able to interpret and respond creatively to what we see. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this later in the Q&A, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Menka. That was really a quick whiz through of something that's actually very real for everybody in everyday life. And I think sometimes we don't realize how much the algorithms are having that impact on us. But right now, we're just going to take a very short pause so that anything you might want to make a note of any reflections or any questions for when we get to the Q&A, you're very welcome to put those into the chat function. So just a very quick 15 seconds just to pause. Okay, so we're next going to hear from Dr. Rachel Lilly. The title of Dr. Rachel Lilly's essay is Urgent Times Need Critical Real-World Research. So I'm looking forward to hearing all about the research that we need in these urgent times. Dr. Rachel Lilly is a behavioural exchange expert. She works with wicked problems, which I love the sound of wicked problems, such as climate change. She's worked in social and environmental change for over 25 years. She's the co-author of Neoliberalism, Behavioural Government in the 21st Century. And if you have a look at some of the things she's done with Welsh Government, it's really inspiring. She is a mindfulness and yoga teacher and has been acclaimed for her world-leading research on decision-making, mindfulness and behavioural insights, working with the Welsh Government, as I said, in the context of their Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So you're very welcome, Rachel, and we look forward to hearing about your essay.
Lovely, thank you, Angela, and thank you, Jamie, and everyone for allowing me to be part of this discussion and put forward an essay. It's yeah, really brilliant that we're discussing this and taking these ideas forward. So I look forward to hearing everyone else. But let me just take a moment. I put together a few slides to try and summarize my my essay in 5 or 6 slides. Okay, yeah, my essay is around, it's called Urgent Times Need Critical Real World Research. And sorry, that flipped a little bit quickly there. And I'm based in Aberystwyth. These are some lovely pictures from Aberystwyth and linked to the Universities of Birmingham and Aberystwyth at the minute. And for me, my work is very much about how we move from the chaos on the left to the wonderful murmurations on the right. Which are beautifully demonstrated by the starlings in Aberystwyth, if you ever want to visit. And as Angela said, I've worked on climate change for going on 25 years now. And in the early days, we thought it was quite a simple information deficit issue. We just needed to tell people what the problem was, and people would then go and do the right thing. Turns out that's not what happens. And climate change, the problem looks more like this these days. And I lifted this from a climate change kick on the internet. So it's a hugely complex problem. Social issues, climate change issues, turns out they're complex. You don't know really what the problem is, never mind about the solution. You might do something somewhere and create more problems elsewhere. So, and also behaviors, which we thought years ago were quite straightforward, turns out they're also really complicated. So the question for me really was, given all this, given that the thinking around climate change, social justice issues and working on them for so long has changed, how does mindfulness fit in here? So mindfulness was created in its own context years ago to deal with first pain and then mental health issues, anxiety, burnout. And it was designed in a context to work with individuals. And there's a sense from me really that sometimes when we're looking at trying to apply this work in on other issues such as climate change, we tend to do a top-down process where we take what's worked elsewhere and we try and use it on these new problems. And I would argue that really we need to go the other way. So in recent years, I've worked with Welsh Government, as Angela said, and also with a project in the East Riding of Yorkshire in a community engagement project. And by really working on the ground, you can really find out, well, what's the problem that's going on here? And how can I adapt mindfulness? And often the outcomes you don't really expect. So I'll just give 2 or 3 examples where, for a start, I needed to make mindfulness in both instances a lot more relational. So using different theories of mind, using different practices presented in different ways, developed over time. I also worked a lot more with cognitive and unconscious bias, something I wouldn't have done in a standard mindfulness course, to work around decision-making, engagement, seeing out of the box. And finally, in the East Riding project, I'm working with adult development. So I'm working with an adult development in community engagement. So it's kind of really, well, unexpected, really, perhaps like this picture, to be adapting these practices to support the needs within that particular project to deal with a systemic issue. So my my suggestion really from my work is that you really have to get down on the ground and really see what's there and start to work with what's there, with the mindfulness, looking at different theories you can use, different practices, adapting them, drawing on other theories. So for mindfulness, for me, for transformation in urgent times, is first off, if you think mindfulness is the answer to the problem that you're looking at, what really is that problem? And what underpinning theories of mind, emotion are most appropriate to deal with that problem? And let's not just take theories necessarily just as kind of from legacy, from things we've used before. Sometimes we need to look for new theories. What individual, group and organizational practices will work best in this context? How can you support changing the system, the way of working in this context? And bearing in mind that systems change over a long period of time. It's a long-term project, and we need to work with people over time. We need to listen well, and we need to adapt well as we go. So hopefully that gives an essence of what I try to put across in the essay. And that's definitely 5 minutes, Angela.
You just got there in time. Well done, Rachel. Thank you very much. Fantastic. Another, it's in some ways it kind of like seems complicated, but it's actually quite simple, I think, what you were saying. And also it kind of like there's a long term versus a short term, because the word urgent would suggest short term, but we will get to the questions. So again, we're just going to have a quick 15-second pause, have a think about what Rachel's just spoken about, any questions or observations or insights that you might like to discuss. So we'll just take a quick pause for 10 seconds and have a think. Okay. We're next going to hear from Dr. Tina Bassi, who I think is on holiday, but she has recorded a video for us. Her essay is called Reclaiming Sangha to Transform Self, Society and Racial Injustice. So again, I think there's a theme coming together about social systems, social behavioural change. And Dr. Tina Bassi is a sociologist at the University of Cambridge. She teaches MBCT and MBSR and is working with the Mindfulness Project on mindfulness and racial awareness. So we're going to have a short video now from Dr. Tina Bassi.
Hi everyone, I'm Tina Bassi. I'm sorry I can't be there with you today online. I am hiking in the Peak District, weather permitting. I'm delighted to be a part of the collection of essays, response pieces to the Mindfulness Initiative's publication on agency in urgent times. I had been reading for quite some time some very sophisticated and mature discussions about the ways in which mindfulness could feed into the way that we as a society were thinking about environmental concerns and the climate crisis. And whilst I was very heartened to see that level of conversation on the evolution of mindfulness practices, I also struggled to see myself as a woman of color, as a Londoner, someone addicted to urban life, in those conversations. I didn't live in the countryside, and I have other problems, other fights going on in my life. I didn't feel that people were necessarily talking about the things that I was worried about or concerned about. Around the same time, I undertook a year-long course at the Sussex Mindfulness Centre to become a teacher of the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy 8-week course, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I had a similar experience in which I was the only woman of color and found the things that I was worried about were not the things that other people were necessarily worried about. I was on a course with a number of NHS staff and people who were clinicians, and they didn't seem as concerned about things around visibility or identity or community. I was lucky that my teachers were very generous with me and shared their Buddhist knowledge and opened my thinking up to the concept of Sangha, of community or congregation. And I was able, really, through the research of Sangha, to find the things that I was looking for. I hope you get a chance to read my contribution. I think that community and the evolution of our thinking within that context of community and society is certainly a key component to understanding agency and what we can do with agency in these very urgent times. So I hope the event goes well, and I do believe my contact details have been shared, so please feel free to get in touch if you want to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, and obviously Tina's not here to have the thanks, but we appreciate her making a video to share with us today. So our last speaker before we get some thoughts from Mark Leonard is Dusana Dorji, and her essay is Why Mindfulness Needs to be Part of and is Not Sufficient for Addressing the Current Societal Crises, of which there are a number, so I'm sure Dusana will help us understand some of that. Dusana is a senior lecturer in psychology and education at the University of York, where she leads the Well Minds Lab. She has also authored 2 books on the neuroscience of meditation and co-authored a mindfulness and well-being school curriculum called Present Course. Recently, she was a consultancy on policy development for the health and well-being areas of learning in Wales, and is an advisor for a UNESCO social and emotional learning initiative. So that's quite a remit as well. All of our speakers seem to have very large remits, so we appreciate you spending your time with us today. So welcome, Dusana, and we look forward to your 5 minutes.
Very much, Angela, for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this important debate. So I'm going to share my screen now. Great. So perhaps what I would like to say first is that I very much liked the fact that the mindfulness and agency paper brings in the mind into the equation of considering the societal crisis. So often when we think about climate change, or when we think about political polarization, or if we think about attention economy, we think about policies, and we think about companies that need to kind of have stricter rules, and we think about other aspects of the society as if the solution was outside of us, right? And a lot of my work over the last 2 years was actually to highlight that mindfulness and particularly well-being capacities, thinking more broadly, have a role to play. They are interconnected with the solutions. And that's what the mindfulness and agency paper, I think, highlights very skillfully. And we need more discussion, more debate, and more highlighting of this point in these debates. So my contribution really focuses or kind of centers around 3 main questions. So I will leave you with more questions than answers, of course. The first one is about the scope of mindfulness. So in the report on mindfulness and agency, mindfulness is understood in this wider umbrella overarching sense, where it includes qualities such as compassion and so on. And the question is how we actually work with the concept of mindfulness. Do we include these qualities under the label or not? And you may think, oh, well, isn't it just a kind of semantics? Isn't it just an academic debate? And I believe that it is not. And I'm going to show you why. So a lot of my work is in the context of education. And this figure shows the latest take on social emotional learning in schools, which is kind of the key well-being provision that we provide in schools. And I was really pleased to see, as part of this proposal, as part of this framework coming from UNESCO, that mindfulness is definitely part of it, but so is empathy and compassion and critical inquiry. So they are singling out these different qualities as separate from each other and obviously interacting with each other. And this is important for practice, because if we say that mindfulness is the kind of path to developing agency, let's say in education, a lot of teachers may just take off the shelf different mindfulness curricula, but many of them will not sufficiently develop actually the skills of compassion, empathy, and critical inquiry. So this is something to keep in mind. How do we understand mindfulness? How does it link to these other qualities? Do we cover all of them? And I believe we do need to actually include all these other qualities. So this links to the other question that I have. So is mindfulness a foundational capacity, or is it part of other wider foundational capacities? So certainly mindfulness is something that is fundamental and very important, and something that we are capable of. But there is nearly maybe 2-3 decades of research where researchers highlighted some key capacities that underlie our well-being and are linked to our ability to actually respond to environmental crises, to behave in a more environmentally friendly way. These capacities, as we know from research, are linked to political polarization. So people who tend to gravitate towards more authoritative views, for example, they have less cognitive flexibility. So there are these overarching capacities, and particularly self-regulation, which can predict actually even how much we earn in adulthood if they are measured in childhood. And I think mindfulness is a key approach that can cultivate particularly the self-regulatory capacity, and in this way support our ability to respond skillfully with agency to the current challenges. But I believe that self-regulation is not enough. And this is again where the question of the scope of mindfulness and its role in cultivating self-regulation comes in. So self-regulation can be actually harnessed for selfish purposes. So some very good self-regulators are very good at bypassing rules for their own selfish goals. So this is why we need to develop another capacity. I call it the self-world capacity that involves our sense of self. And I'm just kind of chuckling at the note of self being part of these capacities, because obviously seems to be central to the debate that we're having right now. So the self-world capacity particularly links to our self-identity. So is our sense of self-identity restricted to our little bubble and our self-interest? Or is it wider, interdependent sense of identity that we have? So this is what this capacity is about, and is closely linked particularly to the qualities of compassion, having a self-transcending sense of purpose. And we know that these qualities are linked to better outcomes and pro-social behavior, better adherence to kind of rules that are good for everybody, and better handling of crises that we have been talking about. So the question I would like to end with is really about the future of mindfulness and its role in fostering these capacities, in answering to these crises that we have been talking about. How do we fully harness the potential of mindfulness? So as we have said before, it is really another big plus of the mindfulness and agency report that it highlighted possible potential of mindfulness outside of clinical context, outside of just making us feel better. And the question is, how do we cultivate mindfulness longer term beyond an 8-week course? And how do we weave in these other qualities that I have mentioned to fully harness its potential in supporting our agency?
Thank you very much, Dusanna. Well done. I'm so impressed with all of our essayists. They're all sticking to their time limit, so well done. That's fantastic. We're just going to move on to Mark Leonard, who's going to give us some initial reflections from what we've heard so far from our speakers today. Before we open it up for questions and answers, before we go to questions and answers, we're actually going to go into a 5-minute breakout room. When we talk about that, there is no obligation to go into the breakout room, but it just, if you like, it gives you a chance just to have a quick chat about what you've heard today. But I'll explain that in a moment, just so that you know, questions and answers will be coming up very shortly. But Mark, over to yourself. Mark actually wrote one of the essays, which was Why We Need Social Mindfulness. And he's been working on a sustainable future. And he believes that social mindfulness provides the key to developing organizational culture that can meet the challenges of our times. But Mark, perhaps you'd like to give us some reflections on what you've heard so far today for a few minutes.
Thank you, Angela. And first of all, I just want to express excitement and gratitude for Jamie and his co-authors in opening up this discussion and shifting, creating a much bigger agenda to explore the function of mindfulness in society. I'm just like everyone else. I select information and stuff that kind of fits my view of things. I ignore other stuff, and when some information comes along that challenges my views, I try to dismiss it. So just reviewing some of the essays that I've read through and trying to piece them together, that's part of what I do, just like everyone else. But I'd just like to start at the end with a really powerful set of reflections that Richard Rioch expresses in his work, in an example of his work working for Amnesty International, when there is really nothing that we can do. What can we do when we seem utterly powerless? But in this context, with facing trauma in a very difficult situations, just bringing this capacity of being present had a huge effect in a very moving way. Moving on, Karen Neal, in her article, she talks about the agency in health and health within agency, and how agency in being able to enact or act out or do things ourselves is such an important part of our lives. And Menka is talking about the way in which we're so easily controlled by the exposure to things that we experience today. So there's a whole series of interesting things that are going on with agency and what's in our control and how we can possibly apply mindfulness to address some of those challenges. I'd just like to mention one little comment of Rachel's in her article. She introduced and tested theories of mind and emotions which situated our embodied selves as emerging from our relationships and contexts, also as more predictive in nature rather than reactive stimulus response machines. So what is mindfulness for? Again, Rachel talks about this a lot. You've heard her explore ideas around thinking, trying to work out what mindfulness is for. She, had this light bulb moment she talked about, which addresses this, which, asks the question, if mindfulness is the answer, what is the problem? So we need to really think about what the problem is to design approaches to, that apply mindfulness to deal with that problem rather than taking off-the-shelf things. Then I'm moving on to sort of some of the articles that talk about individual capacities. We've heard Dusana talk about these individual capacities, particularly combinations of mindfulness and compassion, and possibly how that interacts with, our ability to think critically and engage in sort of actions that bring about change. Francesca Boomser, who's got a background in public health and studying mindfulness in Aberdeen University, also argues in her agency the case for compassion as another foundational capacity. she thinks that compassion combined with mindfulness could have an important role in developing programs that foster agency. So those are some other recurring themes that come out of the essays. So how do we understand the forces that shape us? As individuals, mindfulness meditation may help us in the sphere of our individual lives, but change at a societal level takes a collective shift in beliefs, values, and behavior. How do we do this? Amanda Powell, in her article, talks about mindfulness and our understanding of a reflexive sense of self in relationship to others. Again, this has probably got a very important role to play in understanding how we interact with people and how we shape our sense of self and how this drives our behavior. Siobhan Preston talks about how mindfulness she's CEO of the Mindfulness in Schools projects. She explains that mindfulness enables both the teacher and the student to notice their own constraints, to identify their own values, to engage in dialogue, and to recognize the freedom and the impetus that they have to act both individually and collectively. So there's this individual and collective thing that's going on. We've heard Tina Bassey's recording, who's a sociologist working on mindfulness and racial awareness. Her article, her essay, Reclaiming Sangha to Transform Self, Society, and Racial Justice. We all live within structures and dynamic flows of power that shape our identities, practices, and lifestyles. It has been written elsewhere, she says, on an international level, racism is found to be rooted in a delusion of false sense of self. Structural racism, ethnocentrism, and colonialism are all external manifestations of this condition. So there's something key about understanding our sense of self, our sense of identity, that we have to look at to bring about social change, to create a more inclusive culture. I want to talk about drawing this together, the subject, the phrase that I'm using, social mindfulness, diversity, and collective intelligence, that these capacities can bring us in a social context, in a group. We have to start with people because it's the way we go about things that is causing the problems we face today. And only we can do something about that. But the human mind, like the capacity for awareness in all living beings, is an embodied process. But we have the most advanced social mind that evolution has devised. The human mind is a social embodied mind. As individuals, we can feel disempowered. Caroline Barrett is talking about the culture of striving and competitive achievement in education. Tina Barrett looks at mentions the subject of whiteness, the thorny subject of whiteness. And to conclude, I'll just say, I think this isn't just about whiteness at the breakdown of community. It's about the disconnection of mind, body, and the commercial exploitation of the environment as a resource. I think it's all linked to the idea that we're all stimulus response machines driven by self-interest, and we're all responsible for our own self-improvement. I therefore believe we need to develop ways of teaching mindfulness to help us become consciously aware of the way group culture affects the way we think, and how we can use mindfulness meditation to shape the culture of the group, to release the power of collective intelligence that comes from diversity in the service of the collective needs of the group and the greater good. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a great way, because I think what it highlights, if anybody hasn't had the opportunity to read all of the essays, the great diversity, but actually there's a real core theme through all of the essays. So that was a really good run through and bringing those threads together. I'd like to, before we move on, bring Jamie back in, please.
Thanks, Angela. Mark's done a fantastic job there of just mentioning the other contributors, many of whom we have in the room. So I just wanted to come back in, mention those who hadn't already been mentioned, but that's been done very, very well. And just add my thanks. Thanks to them all. Obviously, we can't, for time reasons, have everyone speaking today, but I encourage you to read through. That's it, Angela. I think it's that's sufficient.
Great. Thank you very much, Jamie. Okay. So we already had a couple of questions in the chat. And in this group I was in, we started talking about well-being and mindfulness being a well-being intervention, and whether we actually have a narrow view of what well-being actually means, and whether we actually need to think about that in a wider sense. And I just wonder whether I could ask Rachel, Dusanna and Menka to perhaps comment on that. And Dusanna, perhaps you might like to go first, because you had a slightly different point of view there.
Thank you, Angela. Yes, so this is a very interesting debate. So how do we transition from the more well-being focused perceptions of mindfulness towards it being a tool in this wider societal context? And something that I have come across in my work was that the problem might be actually with our understanding of well-being. So in the West, in Western cultures, we typically individualize well-being. So well-being is about me, myself, and how I feel, right? Whereas in some other cultures, the understanding of well-being is much more collectively connected. So what we don't have are these wider interconnected theories and understandings of well-being in Western research in psychology. And actually the capacities that I was talking about, they are trying to bridge some of this and claim that it is not enough just to focus on self-regulation as a key to self-regulation. And we know that mindfulness improves self-regulation. So it's not just self-regulation as a means to improve our well-being, but there is this other capacity that links to this wider sense of well-being, that I don't want my well-being to be at the cost of somebody else, right? And this kind of wider understanding of how mindfulness and contemplative practices could contribute through fostering what I call this self-world capacity, this more encompassing, more interconnected, more interdependent sense of self. So I'll just let others speak to that, yeah.
Thank you, Dusanna. Rachel, did you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you, Angela and Dusanna. I think I've got a related but slightly different view, which is almost, I don't really think, really well-being, the word well-being shouldn't even need to exist, should it? Because our way, what we know now is if we work in ways that support human thinking, human flourishing, we don't have a well-being issue. And that what is really happening is that, and certainly in my research, very much on the ground, almost surprising, I think, what I discovered was where people were using mindfulness to build better relationships, to understand their work better, to understand their own minds and how they made decisions and how they do that relationally and in community. Once they got all that, they started to work in very different ways. And when they worked in those very different ways, they were more satisfied with their work. They went home happy. They felt more connected. And so they didn't need a wellbeing intervention then, which is what happens now. We don't deal with like downstream with the issue. So well-being becomes this almost this waste product. If we were a factory, we'd be creating a waste product that would then spend lots of money wiping up, rather than going back and actually working, downstream on the problem, so we don't have the waste product.
Thank you, Rachel. Hopefully, if anybody has any thoughts on that, because I think we could spend the rest of our time actually talking about that, please put again that in the chat function. But I wonder whether Carolyn Mills would like to come off mute and perhaps ask her question that she's put in the chat. I don't know if Carolyn is still with us or not, but if you are, Carolyn, would you like to?
Just a moment, but I've lost the chat. I signed out and signed back in, so it's not up there anymore. But basically, I come from a much more of a design and architecture perspective, but I'm really interested in the wellness side of that. And a lot of you mentioned, the built environment, whether you were talking about the educational environment, you were talking about healthcare. We had one speaker talking about living in an urban environment and that, being able to get out into nature and looking at mindfulness that way didn't really apply to her. And so really my thought process is how come, in this age of wellness and, biophilic design, nudge architecture, Vastu, Feng Shui, all these different ideas that are coming out in design and architecture, how that wasn't factored into your thought processes when you've been writing these papers.
Thanks, Carolyn. So perhaps I shall ask Dusanna to see if she had any thoughts on that first.
I'm not sure if I completely understand the question, but certainly in my work, I'm trying to contextualize well-being and contemplative practices within the environment of education and the systemic perspective on it, from policies through the communities, through school leadership, through what is happening on the ground and the community. So I don't perceive it as detached from it. And I think a lot of the social mindfulness, as Mark calls it, is actually trying to link to this aspect, that it is situated. Mindfulness is not just, again, individualized about our own well-being and health and dealing with our own kind of stress, but it is in this kind of wider societal context that links to the environments. I probably didn't answer your question well, but I'll let Rachel speak to that.
And then perhaps Mark might, or Jamie might like to have some thoughts on that as well. So Rachel, what might you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. Interestingly, I also work on another project that's all about it's a Centre for Urban Wellbeing. So a lot of that is about urban planning and wellbeing in urban areas. And I think it really speaks to what I was saying, maybe in the talk, in the sense that what that really needs is transdisciplinary working to get good urban planning, to get communities that work together to design green spaces, buildings, communities. We talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods now post-COVID. We need people to be working really well together. We need voices to be heard across the system. We need really good collaboration. So there's a lot of there, I think, in the system around knowing what needs to happen. But how do we kind of put the oil in the system to create the kind of collaboration, the kind of co-production that we need to actually make this happen? And actually very little space and time gets put into that relational aspect. And so many aspects of mindfulness could be really used to support that.
Thank you, Rachel. Menka, I know you're still with us. I don't know if there's anything there you might like to say.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating question, and got me thinking a lot about that interplay between, there's that old saying that you shape your environment and then your environment shapes you, and that ongoing conversation that we have. And my master's thesis quite a long time ago now was about how your training colors your problem framing and therefore the solution you come up with. And when it comes to well-being in general, I think this is true, but particularly with digital well-being, most of the solutions are being generated by people with a tech background. So there's a kind of tech problem and a tech solution to it. I think there's a term tech solutionism, which is being applied to that approach. And I think what it short circuits is this kind of call to arms, this spotlight on needing to go into the inner capacities that, the inner capacities for things like mindfulness to be that goes into the root of the solution rather than just the symptoms.
Thanks, Menka. Jamie, did you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I've got a question for Dusanna though.
Okay, excellent.
To move on,
Please do.
I put it in the chat a little while ago. I'm really interested in this idea about critical thinking being important for agency, and in our understanding section, section 2 of the 3, perception, understanding, and action. We talk about different ways in which mindfulness could support decision making. I'd be interested to hear Dusanna talk a little bit more about the things that what makes critical thinking, maybe to define critical thinking a bit. That would be helpful. Maybe explore how the two could work together if they can, or are they very different, and particularly how they could be applied to the digital space, because we talk in the document as well about the information ecology this sort of public realm within which our ideas are shared and tested and truth is sort of decided upon. And the fact that it's being polluted intentionally by some who might be stoking, vaccine hesitancy or conspiracy theories. And yeah, is there a role for a mindful critical thinking, or is it a very different thing? And what's the implication for the digital world?
It's an excellent question. Thank you, Jamie. So I really like the term that you've just coined, mindful critical thinking. I think those two can come together very well. And I think they can complement each other very well. So I'm not sure if I can define critical inquiry very kind of exhaustively right here on the spot. But perhaps what we would understand under critical thinking, critical inquiry, is to be able to assess information in a balanced way and in a way that distinguishes different sources, their accuracy, and is able to make balanced decisions based on that. So something probably in that direction. So mindfulness, I would perceive as creating opportunities or creating the cognitive and affective space to be able to engage effectively in critical thinking. So what I mean by that is that mindfulness, as we know, and in our research in schools with children, one result that we get repeatedly is that mindfulness is very good at cultivating non-reactivity. So being able to relate to our emotions, whether positive or negative, in a less intense way, perceive them in a less intense way. And this is a prerequisite for us to be able to overcome all the built-in wiring biases in our brain that are built on the premise that strongly emotionally kind of valenced information, strong negative information or strong positive information needs to capture our attention immediately because it might be relevant to our survival. And this is very well utilized by all the tech companies and so on in capturing our attention, orienting it and redirecting it, as Menka was talking in her presentation. So I think mindfulness can create conditions that help us kind of deal with this inbuilt kind of, I don't want to say flaw, but inbuilt bias in a way, more skillfully. And then on the foundation of that, we can build more cognitive flexibility. And whether you look at radical political views or even actually climate change behavior, when it comes to the mind, cognitive inflexibility is implicated in either of them. And this non-reactivity is a prerequisite for this more flexible ability to manage our attentions and our views. And now what is missing currently is combining this space, that cognitive space that we can create through mindfulness with a more conceptual understanding of how our decisions can be biased. So for example, I think we should regularly teach in schools that politicians often manipulate our fear, our lack of clear identity, our feelings of being undervalued. And there is research, I could give you references to each one of these to push their political views. And this is, for researchers, it's a common knowledge. For the general public, probably a lot of people are shocked. So we should teach about this, and we should teach about ways to brace ourselves against such manipulation with mindfulness, and then learn about valid sources of information. And I think it is not just about the teaching and about the young people we teach and public in general. I think a lot of weight is also on researchers. I don't think we are doing good enough job in communicating all this research. So there is so much knowledge, so much understanding of what underlies these biases, how to manage our attention better, how to develop critical inquiry. And we are not translating it in a way that is accessible and that can inform education, for example.
Thank you very much, Dusanna. That was a very thought-provoking response, which I would need to take time to actually think about. I'm just aware that we've actually got quite a number of questions in the chat. So I wanted to go back to Bob. I think, Bob, you were next on the list. You had asked, hasn't Buddhism influenced societies over hundreds of years? What, if any, lessons can be learnt from that experience? And I suppose I might ask Mark if he might like to speak first on that one.
It's a really interesting question, and I think it's again one that really is all about understanding social context and how even we are interpreting something that's come out of many millennia of evolution in Asian cultures from a Western perspective. I think that the key thing that I draw from this is understanding that the Buddhist system evolved in a cultural context, and we're looking at it from another cultural context and interpreting it primarily as something that is all about our individual selves, when actually one of the key ideas that comes with this is what Tina Bassi was talking about, Sangha. It's a community, and that community is embedded within wider lay society. And what I'm trying to talk about is trying to understand how our sense of self is embedded within our Western sense of self, and how we're seeing things as a sort of atomized, reduced, mechanical, individualist way of interpreting that, and really coming back to the point of realizing that we need to start working as groups, as collectives, of recognizing the importance of community and how community evolves to shape its environment and the forces, this makes decisions and builds relationships with other communities.
Thank you, Mark. I don't know if there's anyone else want to come in. Jamie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wondered whether invite Richard to Ryok to jump in if he wanted to. One of our as Mark mentioned earlier, contributed one of the essays and has done a lot of as well as working in a senior level in Amnesty International, has done a lot of international work in the Buddhist world. But don't feel put on the spot, Richard. Feel free to say.
Well, I'm usually hesitant to say something because on this subject, because having been to the largest refugee camp in the world, which houses the Rohingya people, and having to speak to them as a Buddhist about what had been done by what we have to admit are our family members, was probably one of the most difficult things, as you can tell from the way I'm speaking, I've ever done in my life. Now, I don't think that it's fair to judge an entire philosophical, religious, and social system by the actions of its extremists any more than it is to judge Islam by ISIS or Christianity by the Spanish Inquisition. But it is salutary to remember that all these magnificent wisdom traditions, including mindfulness, in a sense are a guide, or as we would say, a path of practice. And the extent to which an individual or a group or the society as a whole is able to actually put that into practice is the challenge that faces all of us at this time, whether we're in a Buddhist society officially or not. So that's perhaps what I might offer.
Thank you, Richard. That's very thoughtful, provoking too. Minga actually wanted to come in this point too. Minga.
Thank you, Angela. I just wanted to add on this point about ancient wisdom traditions, that there's just so much richness in terms of concepts and practices. So mindfulness comes from a certain tradition, but there's associated practices that go together with it. And I think in the process of secularization and clinicalization of the trainings, some of those supportive mechanisms have been a little bit diluted. And so just to share one, for example, that comes from the Jain wisdom tradition, which I was thinking about in the context of filter bubbles. There's a concept called anikantvad, which it translates to many-sided reality. And it's a way of remembering to stay humble, especially when we're having such a personalized web experience and we're exposed to fewer and fewer sides of reality. So it's just these kinds of concepts which which are worth exploring alongside mindfulness that it's, support us in a really meaningful way.
Thank you, Minka. I'm just going to go first of all to Julia Adams' question, which was, how can mindfulness help us to cultivate more intentional thoughts and behaviours, which will in turn contribute to a more mindful society moving forwards? And I think some of the speakers have talked about the whole social and behavioural situation in society and how that, the systemic issues that we need to address. But Juliet's question, and perhaps Rachel, we could go to yourself first on that one.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting question, Juliet. Thank you for that. I think the interest for me is, looking into behavioural science, actually how complex so many of our behaviours are, and how it's almost impossible for us to have the intention to change all of them, because even the most basic things that we do, I mean, toilets, showers, recycling, are huge complex issues which require infrastructures, relational aspects. So for me, it's really how we can bring mindfulness in to address that whole picture, because we need more than the intentionality. We need to understand, for a start, we need to understand that, I think, as Mark picked out, we're completely emergent out of our relationships, out of our infrastructures, and how can we bring mindfulness in to kind of get that, to really get that we're, in a way, I think we're still talking too much about individual here and not enough about the interconnectivity of everything, which is a much more difficult but really interesting way forwards in terms of how we use the mindfulness and where our intentionality and how much kind of, because it's got a kind of cognitive load to it, intentionality, where we use that little bit that we can in ways once we've set up everything else, I think would be the key question for me.
Thanks, Rachel.
I'd just like to point towards the work on mindfulness-based strengths practice. Okay. And of course ACT, it being about identifying your values and using that sort of values connection to reinforce your intention to do something, and normally a kind of a health behavior, and that's kind of proven to be efficacious in a clinical context. But there are these new innovations and such as mindfulness-based strengths practice, where the idea is around it's kind of more of an ethical slant, where you're identifying something that you want to cultivate and bring into your life, valuing it, developing intentions, and it's really early days for that. I think it's that intention clarification and setting, and then coming back to it and measuring our behavior by that. It's tremendous potential there. I think that's what people get out of mindfulness courses, but it's not explicit enough. I think Juliet's asking a really good question there, which really goes to the heart of this agency question. As I started off by saying, what is agency? We say it's intentional action, and you can have, and then once you've sort of clarified it, you can have the best will in the world, to use that sort of popular phrase, but without the kind of capacity to then act and all the other things that support the acting on it, it won't get you very far. So that's the nub of it.
It is the nub of it. Thank you, Juliet, for bringing that to the fore.
A quick comment. I think there is a cultural context for mindfulness in our culture. It's a post. There are lots of things going on here, and it's mixing with it. And there are aspects that are there are all sorts of intrinsic assumptions about civil society, about the rule of law, about democracy, and there are assumptions about the way we act as individuals within this system. And what's emerging is how this practice is interacting with those. Now, some of these aspects of this practice have kind of got very simple biological functions of regulating emotion and making us calmer and enabling us to think a little bit more with a bit more perspective. Now, that's the bare essentials of it, but it's still interacting within a cultural context that has all sorts of remarkably good elements to it as well, with general assumptions of how one should go about living an ethical life that we've inherited from Judeo-Christian traditions. So, if you like, I think what many of us are trying to do is to weld this particular practice that has become there's so much interest in it, that has become as a sort of panacea to our ills, to see how we can make this more constructively engage with our culture.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think it goes back to that whole debate about it being about well-being, but it's much wider than that. Rachel, you put your hand up. I think you wanted to just come in and make a comment.
Well, I just wanted, speaking back to, sorry, was it Stuart? Was it?
Stuart, yes.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. It also speaking to other comments that I've seen on the thread, that we have these standardized kind of courses, and I think what we need is to develop mindfulness for a new culture that actually addresses issues of inequality, diversity, that really speaks to that. And so we need a maturing of these mindfulness programs that actually, I think it's the fact that the programs are too off the peg and not really adaptable, cannot really work in, well, I've said it, really having these complex ways to address diversities, inequalities, things like class, different minority issues. We need to bring a new mindfulness forward, not with reference to their previous kind of cultural basis, but I think there needs to be something new. I think there needs to be a maturing.
I think that's a very good point to finish on, Rachel. A maturing of mindfulness within society. Jamie, would you like to make some closing remarks, please?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to end on. So I won't over egg it. But I would like to say that we hope the conversation will continue. That in whatever way the Mindfulness Initiative can, we will look for new opportunities to have more conversations like this. If you have any ideas for how we might do that, please answer us on a postcard, send us an email, get in touch via our website. Luke Rayford, who's one of the co-initiators of the Mindfulness Network for Social Change, has just put a link in the chat there. I just wanted to highlight that as a great forum for developing these conversations amongst innovators and thinkers in the space. So yeah, and thank you very much, Angela, for stepping in and for hosting the session. Skillfully done.
Thank you, Jamie. And I would just finally like to thank all of our contributors today to a really rich debate. I think, as we've just said, this is only the start of the debate. And I think, as Jon Kabat-Zinn said, it's about how can we collectively take the conversation forward. And I think that would be quite interesting, because it's very good having such rich and vibrant debate, but we have to do something, and going back to the word urgent, it's urgent we actually make change. But thank you very much to all of our contributors today. Thank you to everyone coming along and joining in the conversation and having such great rich comments in the chat function. And Jamie will actually obviously be thanking our wider essayists, as he did earlier. Jamie, you look like you want to come back in again.
I've forgotten to particularly name check Marianne Thackeray, who helped me with the editing process, and on a couple of them in particular. So yeah, she's here today. I just wanted to sort of name check her. Thank you so much for your help.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you to everyone at Mindfulness Initiative who have put this together and started the debate. So good night. If you're watching Wimbledon, go and enjoy it, or if you're doing something else, go and have a fun evening or day, or wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks
good
so
night.
Much for coming.